Regionalized America is the way I approach it is a little bit different. Matter of fact, I even had done a little bit of exploring in a couple of the online textbooks and in the paper copy of the textbook. Um, I'm kind of condensing this into one kind of PowerPoint. These are really several different concepts kind of layering together. On one hand, you've got the impact of the market economy. On another hand, you've got society and social changes. On another hand, you've got political changes. So I'm going to kind of give you the broad overview of this regionalized America. And then hopefully over the coming weeks, we'll kind of add to this kind of framework. So understand that I'm giving you a broad overview. Think of this as a skeleton, and we're going to begin to add some stuff to it to enhance your understanding. But this will give you a generalized context of the United States as we're marching towards the Civil War. Of course, the Civil War is this turning point experience for the United States, but it doesn't happen out of nowhere. It's not like just all of a sudden everybody quit getting along. It really is the product of decades of compromises that don't make anybody happy, of societal changes, of economic disruptions, and these things all kind of create a perfect storm. But just like a storm has elements of precipitation and moisture and air, pressure and all that kind of stuff. The storm that becomes the United States is made up of these regions, okay? So regionalized America begins first and foremost with the issues in the North. Of course, we've already talked a lot about the market revolution, so I don't know that we need to deep dive into that. If you're still fuzzy about what the market revolution is, what the market economy is, what the American system, those are all kind of synonyms for what I'm talking about. This idea of factories, of workers that clock in and clock out, of this wealth gap, of the fact that you've got a large group of workers, you've got a smaller but still relatively large group of middle class people that have education, that have some degree of property, and then you have a much smaller group of very wealthy. And you have this concept of cities developing and all the things that go with urbanization. Urbanization is a term we haven't really quite emphasized too much, but it's a term you should start to get familiar with. Urbanization is the concept of an expanding city. Expanding cities tend to have problems like transportation, like neighborhood issues, like you're going to have poor neighborhoods, wealthy neighborhoods, all that kind of stuff. Communication, technology, entertainment, lots of things going into all of this. And of course, a very kind of fast-paced sort of environment. This market revolution, this aspect of the North is going to be really kind of the dominant factor that we're going to see when we get to the Gilded Age. Okay, so get kind of familiar with the way this operates. Another big component of urbanization and life in the North is going to be immigration. We see immigration, and you might have heard, picked up in a few different places, that the Irish immigrants start coming in roughly in the 1830s, but particularly by the time you get to the 1840s, you have the Irish potato famine. If we were British history, we would dive off into how the potato famine happens. But you have kind of this blight on the potatoes that push people into leaving Ireland and coming to the Americas. This provides that working kind of group of people to take the place of the women, really kind of change the factory system in a lot of ways. You also have German immigration coming in. If you're familiar with Texas history, this is when some of your German immigrants come into Texas. And one of the issues that we see developing with this type of immigration, and we actually touched on this a little bit when we looked at things like the Alien and Sedition Acts, and when you kind of looked at the Hamilton, Jefferson kind of argument. What does it mean to be an American? How do you know when you have reached whatever level of consciousness to be qualified as an American? Is it based on your occupation? Is it based on your wealth? Is it based on how long you've lived here? Is it based on if you're a good person? Is it based on your religion? Is it based on the language you speak? Is it based on how much you have assimilated? Lots of pesky questions. And as we talked about in our Indian removal role play, it's made even more complicated when you're looking at groups of American Indians that are living within the United States, that groups like the Cherokee that are claiming we're more assimilated than, the Irish or the German or whatever. And we're being forced to move. Why does this make sense, right? So how being an American is defined is an incredibly important thing. Remember, we're looking at African Americans who have been here some family lines since the 1600s, and we're telling them they don't qualify as American citizens. We're looking at women and telling them they don't qualify as American citizens. And yet we're turning to Irish men or German men who may or may not be fully assimilated and saying, you get to be an American now. Lots of pesky questions, and understand that sometimes the answer for the Irish and the German men is you don't get to be an American. You have groups of people that really push back against immigration and see the Catholic influence as being a threat to American Protestantism. Remember, America, we have Catholics in America going back to the colonial period, but they're not the largest group. It's predominantly this Protestant group. And we saw with the Great Awakening, kind of the rise of Methodism and that sort of thing. Well, that's only going to continue to develop as we move into the 1800s. You're going to have these distinct ethnic neighborhoods. This is a typical characteristic of cities where people tend to live in areas where people act like them, think like them, celebrate the same holidays, speak the same language. So a big part of this period is going to be how do we homogenize? How do we make our American culture resilient and become unique so that it doesn't get taken over? This angst about the American culture being taken over is a long-standing one. We've been having it. I mean, one could even argue back when we were concerned about the influence of the French and bringing their ideas of republicanism and democracy into our system. This is what the Alien and Sedition Acts were about. So this is not a new concept. And we do definitely see in 2017 that there's a lot of emphasis on this as far as, building a wall. Concerns about, having lists and vetting people and all that kind of stuff. But that's not a new concept. We've been down this road before. We can look to the past and see how that worked out, how it didn't work, how it did work, that kind of thing. Northern issues are incredibly different than what we see happening in the South. The South does not have the social class pressure that the North has. And I think it's important for you to kind of realize that this concern about the poor, this concern about social classes, this concern about these poor neighborhoods, about social problems. If you're living in a city and people are kind of cramped together, even if the middle class has their own kind of section of the city, they're still going to be concerned about fire spreading from the poor neighborhoods. They're going to be concerned about disease. They're going to be concerned about sanitation. We don't have a public school system at this point. So the question is, what are we going to do with these kids that, are just roaming the streets? And violence. If you're a big fan of, the Gangs of New York movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, this kind of depicts an element of this kind of ethnic gang mentality of nativism versus the Irish, that kind of thing. And you can throw into that African Americans as well. These groups also pushed back against African Americans that were free and living up north as well. So lots of interest in controlling prostitution and drunkenness, maintaining kind of a moral standard. This was a big issue for northern cities because everybody's so close together, right? Even if you're not actually living in the city, you're relatively close to a city. So if a disease breaks out, if prostitution becomes a major problem in this town, it's going to affect people not that far away. And again, you have extensive transportation networks in the north, and so that's going to make these social problems much more easily transferred from one area to another. So transportation and communication are very, very important. This is a particular drawing about the 5 Points area. This is what I was talking about with Gangs of New York. The 5 Points area in New York was an early immigrant neighborhood. Of course, now if you ever go to New York and look at the 5 Points area, it's, 5 Points is a bunch of business, office buildings, and I think there's a park there and that kind of thing. But back in the early 1800s, in the 1830s and such, the 5 Points area was kind of this centerpiece where you had several ethnic neighborhoods that kind of joined into the same kind of common kind of hub, if you will, of transportation and roads. And so you had a number of kind of fights that would break out. This was a relatively poor neighborhood and that kind of thing. So you see that the middle class in the North, because of this expanded factory system, it's, and I kind of touched on this the other day when we were talking about the market economy, but the factory system is, by its very nature, you have this larger group of factory workers who are not necessarily getting paid that well. Obviously, skilled workers are getting paid better. Unskilled workers are getting paid less. But both of those groups are going to have managers and supervisors. There's going to be teachers. There's going to be doctors. There's going to be lawyers. There's going to be accountants. There's going to be, merchants. There's going to be people that are kind of in that middle kind of rung of between the wealthy that have the investment money to spend to kind of develop this factory system, that also have the investment money to invest in banks and have the connections with politics. And then you've got the workers that are just showing up every day doing their job. So the middle class exists in this middle piece. And they tend to live to one degree or the other. Again, I'm kind of oversimplifying this, but to one degree or the other, they are representing kind of a comfortable existence. Not so rich that they have unlimited free time or that they don't ever have to work or all they do is go to parties, but that they're wealthy enough that they can enjoy some leisure, that they can that they go to watch shows, they go to the theater, they have time for reading, they go to church, they engage in reform activities. So when we start talking about reform in the 1800s and the religious movements in the 1800s, this is why this really kind of takes off, because you have a relatively large group of people, whether they are, northern kind of urbanization, kind of middle class, these kind of pieces of the factory system, or whether you're more kind of middle class farmers. These groups are going to be very kind of open to reform, open to religious movements, because they have the time to think about it. They have the time to be concerned about moral behavior. They have the time to focus on education. This is really what they're kind of concerned with. And so again, this middle class is going to be kind of especially up north, is going to be the linchpin of changing things. And so things like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a book that details kind of the horribleness of slavery, does so in a very exaggerated way. We kind of mentioned this when we talked about Northup. But one of the reasons this becomes immensely popular is because the middle class is reading it, and they're shocked and appalled. For some of these people in the North, this is the first time they've really understood anything about slavery. So we might nitpick kind of the way Stowe kind of portrays this story, especially in contrast with, say, an authentic memoir like Northup's story. But that doesn't change the fact that it resonated with this middle class. And so you cannot separate the reform movements of the 19th century from this growth in the middle class. And we're going to see this trend develop again in the latter part of the 1800s after the Civil War, when we see the middle class kind of expand once again. When they expand, they will raise awareness about social problems and that sort of thing. And again, these are informed, educated people. They interact with the poor, but because of their social class, they have access to things that make them more aware. These are the people that politicians most want to appeal to, both then and now, which I think is interesting. You're going to see, I think, actually, you know what? I think I'm going to stop here, and I'll pick up talking about 18.